An optimist's message in a pessimistic world. The struggle for individual and social liberation is not a metaphor. It is a struggle. And because your oppression or the oppression of your community is all-consuming, the struggle becomes all-consuming. It dampens your joys, it adds depth to your sorrows. You look at the horizon and see the sun ever setting and the darkness ever encroaching. It can feel at times that you have been cursed with vision only to see people suffer. It can feel at times that you have been cursed with hearing only to hear people's tears. It can feel at times that you have been cursed with free will just to drive home the point that you could have done more. So in the face of that, what becomes the point of dedicating yourself to the struggle? The older I get and the more I have learned, the more I have come to see this as the wrong framework for understanding my place in the struggle. The first reason is, like all my other youthful passions, as is common for most young people, my vision of the world was self-centered. If I wanted to see a difference in the world, I wanted to take ownership of that difference. I did not want to be a nameless statistic in the record of human progress. I wanted to write some of the pages. It is a common thing with idealistic young people, I think, and when you finally truly realize that the pages of history cannot be turned by a single pair of hands, it is crushing. At first, because of the self-centeredness of youth, this idea is depressing, but as you get older or learn more, it becomes a liberating one. Because one day you realize that the pages of history have never truly been turned by a single pair of hands. That throughout history, there has never been an individual to truly make a big difference. When people talk about the great people of history, that is a reductionist framework to explain a complex subject. The stories of Malcolm X, Ida B. Wells, Gandhi, Sarojini Naidu, Kwame Nkrumah, and all the other liberation leaders are not just the story of an individual person, but the story of all the people in their movements. It is the story of all those nameless figures that created the environment for change, and these figures are just the most visible. It is like seeing the head of a giraffe above a canopy of trees and assuming that it is floating instead of being attached to a body you don't see. And then you ask yourself the most logical question. Why is this reductionist version of history the most propagated? This is where the breakthrough comes, because you realize this is the version of history that helps maintain the status quo. It not only devalues the contribution of unnamed individuals can make to a struggle, but it also turns the leaders of these movements into grand figures that become impossible to emulate. Everyone wants to be Martin Luther King on the podium saying, "I have a dream," when the reason that speech changed history is all the nameless people who heard that speech. If he had said a speech just as profound to an indifferent people or an empty crowd, he would have had no impact on history. So if you think of Martin Luther King as a person who was so charismatic that simply his words changed history, that is impossible to live up to. If you think of him as the accumulation of a movement, that becomes possible. It was not only that his vision was acted upon by the collective action of people, it is that his vision is the result of the collective vision of people. His beliefs, the way he expressed himself, and the traditions he drew upon were the result of his communal spiritual inheritance, and not only from the African American tradition, but from the tradition of the global struggle for liberation. In the same way children are raised by the collective, leaders are created by them, and their visions are an expression of that collective. The reductionist version of history that separates leaders from their movements seeks to stop people from participating in the struggle. It seeks to deny them ownership of history. If you think of Martin Luther King as a person who changed history, how could you live up to that? If you think of Martin Luther King as the expression of collective will in a movement you only have to participate in, it becomes easy. Whatever you can contribute to the struggle adds to its power. You make it more likely for us to create new leaders for the struggle. This reductionist vision of history that denies the massive individual's ownership of history has two sides. It denies the oppressed sovereignty and power, but it also denies the guilt of your oppressor. Because the stories of Columbus, King Leopold, Hitler, Emperor Showa, and Churchill, and all the other oppressors in history are also not just the story of an individual person, but the story of the people that were part of their movements. They too were expressions of collective vision. They would not have had any impact on history if not for all the nameless, evil, or uncaring people that supported them. So in the same way this vision conditions those of us in the struggle to devalue our participation so as to not change the system or challenge it, this devalues the guilt of the oppressor so they don't feel a need to change as individuals. All the guilt for a movement gets thrown onto someone like Hitler, that somehow all the genocidal campaigns of Nazi Germany were birthed in his soul. It had nothing to do with the soul of the average German that should have been addressed societally to cleanse the society of that rot. Which is why when modern Germany first started to support the genocide in Palestine, I immediately assumed Hitler had come back to life to force this evil onto this beautiful nation of saints. In America, I was always struck when people talked about George Wallace, a conservative politician who was governor of a state until 1987. His I Have a Dream speech was segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. And what struck me is how dismissive the average white person in America was about him, mocking his garish open racism and labeling him as an unimportant figure, when most political scientists acknowledge he fundamentally shifted American politics by galvanizing working class whites against federal authority, civil rights, and liberal elites. He established positive polarization, this us against mentality that became a mainstay of American conservative political strategy. That's when I realized America and the white people who participated in racial bigotry wanted me to think that George Wallace was a tree with no roots, that they were not connected to him, that it was not the mass of white people that made all of this evil possible. It was just him. And if only they can trick me into thinking that it was all George Wallace by himself, I can't ask about their participation in that evil. I can't demand that they change as individuals. This was clarified to me with the election of Donald Trump. Almost every white person I personally know deeply loathes him and thinks he is responsible for increasing the amount of bigotry in America. When I speak to them, almost every single one of them has friends, associates, or family that supports him and believed everything he says before he was ever a public figure. Somehow, as they throw all the blame onto this one orange buffoon and deny the guilt of all their fellows who believe the same, they never hear how absurd it sounds. So do not be deceived. There is a historic and ongoing struggle between the oppressors and liberators of all places in all times. And this reductionist view of history is to obscure the fact that the oppressors are losing. The inheritance of oppressors is naked power dressed as anything but. The inheritance of liberators is the real history of the world. The systems of oppression are ultimately simple and do not need historic records to draw upon. They need historic reasons to justify. The people who are creating concentration camps in America right now are not drawing on the history of Nazis because it is a complicated idea and they don't know how to use naked force. That history justifies the behavior for them. The people who are fighting against the genocides happening around the world from Sudan to Palestine, from Syria to Myanmar, need history to draw upon. They reach out to lessons in history to see how their predecessors in liberation changed the past so they can do the same. Because when some of us are not safe, none of us are safe. The women fighting for female liberation from Africa to the Americas, from Europe to Asia, look to the historic examples to see how their predecessors fought for their liberation. Because while women are oppressed somewhere, they are oppressed everywhere. The people fighting for the liberation of the worker being grinded beneath the wheel of capitalist exploitation look back on history and see ultimately it is about the exploitation of human effort. That the best type of worker to an employer is a slave, and when some of us are slaves, we can all be enslaved. So when you look through history, you see that the arc of the moral universe may be long, but it does bend towards justice. That even now, year after year, there are more people born with access to love, life, and family. That more countries of the global majority have true sovereignty. That more women are born in a world that treats them as equals. That more children are born in a world that is safe for them. That more old people live in a world that will let them die with dignity. And this continual march of human progress is the collective reward for the endeavors of all the nameless people in history who stood for liberation. For many it might be the only reward, but it is no less sweet for being so. Do not let the tragedies of the day narrow your vision of the world. You are not alone. No one has ever been alone in this struggle. Even when it feels like you are screaming into a void and that your struggle has no meaning, that is never true. History is a river that winds through time, and there is beauty and honor in being a drop in that river. But more so, there is solidarity, there is love. The love you have for all the nameless people who helped to historically defend your liberation. And love that someone will have long in the future without ever knowing your name because you tried to defend theirs. This certainty that things will eventually get better for most people, even if you are not here to see it, provides a reason to be optimistic. It demands optimism. This certainty that the evils that persecute are temporary, while the sanctity of human dignity that you wish to defend is permanent.